This is Global Tennessee, news, analysis, and commentary from the Tennessee World Affairs Council in Nashville. Global Tennessee is produced in association with the Center for International Business at Belmont University and the International Business Council of the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce. The World Affairs Council is a nonpartisan, nonprofit educational association, and the views expressed on Global Tennessee are those of the participants.
Welcome to the June 9th edition of Global Engagement. I'm Patrick Ryan.
And I'm Dick Bowers.
Today we're going to talk about the top 5 topics in the news from the past week. And we up front will apologize for a slight delay in getting started here. We had some technical difficulties, but we're good to go now. So Dick, can you share our list of topics for the week?
I see them on the screen there, Pat. So the first topic is global solidarity of the Black Lives Matter movement and talking about the effect that the tragic death of George Floyd had on the world, because it's not just a United States phenomenon. Second up is troop reductions in Germany. Kind of a surprise. They hit everybody, including the Germans here. So we'll see what that's all about. And then we've got China propaganda attacks coming on strong. And then let's talk about Libya, which has been in the news, and there's stuff happening in that country we ought to be aware of. And finally, the Israel West Bank annexation. What does that mean for the United States and what's happening? So, but first, let's take our quiz question, which is taken from the Monday morning What in the World weekly quiz. And if you don't get that in your take on Monday morning, you should and you can. And just send a little note, ask Pat how to do that. And the question is, quote, while the job is not done, there is no denying this is a milestone. Thank you, New Zealand, said this Prime Minister in comments marking the elimination of COVID-19, one of the first nations to achieve this milestone. The question is, who is the Prime Minister of New Zealand? A, Jacinda Ardern, B, Wynne Cooper, C, Nancy Wake, or D, Frances Hodgins? And we will go through the news, and at the end, we'll tell you the answer to that question. Pat?
Great. Thanks, Dick. First up, we're going to talk about the international implications of the Black Lives Matter protests over the killing of George Floyd 2 weeks and a day ago. And we've seen in the last weekend and a couple of days before that, protests erupt literally around the world across mostly Western Europe, but the Middle East, Africa, Australia, and some countries in Southeast Asia. And those are depicted on the slide there. I think the main takeaway from this, Dick, is that the United States, which and you can probably take the lead talking about the diplomatic impact of this, but the United States has championed democracy, human rights, and justice around the world for decades, and now we're being called to account around the world. You can see demonstrators outside embassies, and in the slide you can see some young men outside the Swiss embassy. That's in Tehran. So countries, including Iran and others, are now lecturing the United States, and we're going to talk a little bit about Chinese propaganda further down in the program. But that does have major implications for our international efforts abroad.
Well, Pat, for most of my lifetime, we were the shining city on the hill, and we held up human rights and liberty and freedom and all of these kinds of things. But the reality is that America has been a racist nation since its beginning. We put slavery in our Constitution, counted Black people as 3/5 of a person for census purposes. And although we fought a civil war to end slavery, we've never really come to grips with the racism in the United States. And I sense that this is a moment that's changing American history. I don't think this movement is going to go away, and I think there are going to be some fundamental shifts. A lot of people at the local level in the United States are talking about budgetary shifts. in cities, shifting money out of the police budget and into things like taking care of the homeless in a better way and mental health facilities and things of that sort. If we have a problem with a kid who's a truant in school, often we'll send an armed police officer to do something about that. And that just doesn't make a lot of sense. So
Right.
I think you're going to find that all around the world, this movement is going to resonate and things will change. It's not going to be the same.
Well, the impact, I think, on diplomacy is going to be that diplomats are less able to tout the United States as you said, the shining city on the hill, but rather it looks like the impact of the protest movement here is going to have a lasting effect on the American image abroad. That it's no longer Foggy Bottom or the White House that will be projecting the values of the United States, but people in the streets.
Yeah. Well, the last 3 years of the Trump administration, there's been some confusion about what those values are. I mean, we since the Second World War have been, well, since First World War, actually, we have been involved in the international arena. And now we are doing what's, for lack of a better term, is, make America great, and we go it alone. We don't need anybody else.
Yeah.
That doesn't work. I mean, we're in this world together, and we do a lot better job when we work on it together. And especially when you look at the response that we've made to the COVID-19 affair. It's not just us, it's everybody. And this is going to have a major effect on how we engage the world. And we see what Mr. Trump does.
Well, and you mentioned COVID, and that's another aspect of this story that not just on the streets of America, but abroad, even in the face of the pandemic, people are coming out to protest. So that's remarkable in the influence of the movement. I don't know if you saw on TV in Bristol, England, they pushed over the statue of a slave trader into the river. They really were showing passion for.
Well, I think you're going to find a lot of that in the United States coming down the road, and I think there's going to be a major push. I would not see that things are going to be the same. And in fact, I think there will be a major effort to figure out something on reparations. How does America make whole what it has done to the Black Americans from slavery to today?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how you do that, but I'm sure we need a national dialogue on race.
Yeah.
Just like South Africa had a national dialogue on how did they overcome apartheid. So,
well, yeah, you're right. We've seen the likelihood of a transformation in American foreign policy, where we fit in the world, a transformation on the economy, and the questions after the pandemic of healthcare and benefits for labor, especially people who depend on their workplace for healthcare and other benefits. Yeah. So I think this whole pandemic, George Floyd incident are going to have, as you say, lasting impact on the changing face of America. Well, let's move on to our next item, Dick. It's the Trump administration plan to cut troop strength in Germany. And I don't know if you have any stories from back in the Cold War days in Berlin, but you were an American troop in Germany back in the day. Probably when the troop strength there was much higher than 34,000 Americans stationed in Germany. I think what was the high point in the Cold War? 270,000 GIs and airmen based in Germany. It was a staggering number of Americans there. But that was to forestall the Soviet Union, who occupied East Germany. Probably isn't the right word, who were stationed forward deployed.
Flippant kind of expression that was often used during the Cold War is in referring the U.S. presence in Europe and NATO. They had three purposes. One was to keep the Americans engaged in Europe, so keep the Americans in. Second, keep the Russians out. Don't let the Russians come and take it over militarily or politically or economically. And third was keep the Germans down. The Germans basically were viewed as the bad guys. They started the First World War from the view of some, and they started the Second World War, and that we just don't want them to do it again with the Third World War. Germans are a very organized and capable people. So those three things were important. And the US troop presence since the end of the Cold War basically has been in the US interest there. We've used Germany as a major base to support our activities in the Middle East and Afghanistan. The Air Force Base in Frankfurt is one of the huge activities that we have there, along with hospitals. So guys and gals who get injured in the battlefield in the Middle East or in Afghanistan or in Africa will get medevaced into Germany in the first instance before it gets stabilized and then on back to the United States. So the thing that struck me most about this is another problem I have with the kind of diplomacy being practiced by the current White House. You don't surprise your allies and enemies by just having them read a tweet. Evidently, this idea of withdrawing US troops was just not coordinated with the Germans. We didn't discuss it with them. And we just said, well, it's our troops. We're going home. Goodbye.
Yeah. And you're right. We evolved our missions in Germany. Keeping the Germans down might have been important in the 50s, but late 60s, early 70s, Germany was a full partner in the defense, the NATO defense of Western Europe. They were circumspect in their deployments elsewhere, but Germany and the rest of our NATO presence in Europe, as we got increasingly involved in the Middle East and North Africa, as you mentioned, Landstuhl, the hospital, and Ramstein, one of the largest air bases in the world, was the anchor for U.S. forces in that half of the planet. So it's going to be interesting. As you said, this was a tweet surprise to the Germans. They have not reacted discreetly. They've been, I don't think Angela Merkel has said anything on her own, but people close to her have really reacted poorly to this. It's really a blow to NATO and U.S. presence in the region. We've been beefing up our forces in Poland, which is now a NATO nation, but there's still a great value in maintaining that presence in Germany. So I think there's going to be some examination of this. I know the Senate is going to take a look at it. Senator Jack Reed on the Armed Services Committee is pretty concerned about this being pulling the rug out from our relationship with Germany.
Well, he should. I mean, the part of the problem I have is that everything we do around the world, we should be continually looking at, does this continue to make sense? Just because you did it in the past doesn't mean you'd have to do it in the future. But if you're going to change something, how you go about doing these things is critical. You want to end up with a positive relationship, building upon what you're doing, rather than everybody mad at each other and throwing barbs at each other and being upset. We have a legitimate need to be engaged in Europe to protect America. And how we do that can be up for discussion, but you don't just decide, we'll just bring home 1/3 of the troops we have there. And, why? Why are we doing this? What's going to be left? What's the option? What are the things we're trying to achieve? And none of that has come out other than just the idea that, we're going to withdraw.
Yeah. Well, the other day I was reading a section of the National Security Strategy 2017 that the Trump administration released, and you might wonder why I sit around reading the National Security Strategy. That's the reason I don't get into any of the novels that you keep sending over.
There you go.
But there was a section in there that laid out several points of how we go about setting the strategy and dealing with the world, and a couple of those included phrases like ensuring the prestige of the United States is maintained abroad, ensuring our interests and alliances are maintained. So we have this grand strategy, and when the Trump administration came out with it, there were a lot of critics. But it looks like every time we make one of these steps, it's not consistent with any grand strategy.
I agree. And it's, it boggles my mind because it doesn't have to be this way, but it goes back to the cardinal principle of leadership. What are you going to do? How do you get the right plan in place? And then how do you mobilize those who are going to execute the plan to buy into it, to make sure that this is, indeed, this is what we should be doing. Let's get at it.
Yeah. Well, speaking of getting at it, let's get on topic 3 of our grand tour of the world here, and that would be China. We seem to we didn't have a COVID standing topic today, but we are into China once again, and it seems like China is going to be among our top topics of the week in these news reviews for some time to come. This week we're talking about the propaganda war between the United States and China, and this stemmed largely from the Wuhan, the incidents of the pandemic originating in Wuhan. The Trump administration, the president and the Secretary of State were calling it the Chinese virus and the Wuhan virus. So that was part of the groundwork. And there were, about that same time, there were charges from the Chinese that, and these were not directly attributable to Xi Jinping or the foreign ministry, but voices of influence were talking about the virus had originated in the United States in a U.S. Army laboratory. The Trump administration took great exception to that. But I think we can see that from the beginning of this pandemic, that the Chinese government has been very determined to not just contain the virus, but also to tell the story in their own way about how the pandemic got going and how it became a global issue. So they're trying to seek to portray themselves as being smart about how this was handled, and also at the same time being generous to other countries around the world. And you can see that they provided PPE to, for example, Italy and Spain when they were in their darkest hour of dealing with the pandemic.
And the United States was not engaged. We were looking inward and doing our own thing. The whole Chinese virus thing, I mean, politically, it serves the president to have the China bogeyman out there. But the reality is the virus doesn't respect national borders. The virus is going to go where it's going to go, and where it can find a nice, warm, rosy place to live.
Right.
And that's what's happening. And one of the interesting things is that if you look at the statistics shift a little bit from China to COVID, it seems to me that those countries that have populist sort of strongman leadership are the ones that are having the hardest time coming to grips with the virus. Those that are the most open, transparent, like New Zealand, seem to have the best way of controlling that virus. So, Brazil is having a tough time. The United States is having a tough time. I think that the idea of an open, transparent kind of a regime is what you have to do. But we've got ourselves into a tit for tat with China. So they say something, we say something, we link it to trade, we link it to visas for journalists, we link it to airplane landing rights, various kinds of things, none of which helps fight really the virus, but creates more enmity and difficulty in our relationships.
Yeah, Dick, I think that you dropping back a paragraph there, you intentionally or unintentionally lumped us in with the non-transparent autocratic regimes, but
I think
we'll leave.
We have a populist leader who is doing his own thing. And when you look at the statistics as to how many people are getting COVID, we're up at the top of that list.
Oh, sure. We've got 4% of the global population, and approximately 25% of the COVID infections.
Well,
so there's something to be examined there. But looking at China, I think that their goal in all of this is that they want to be seen as a leader on the world stage, that they could use the pandemic to capitalize on their reaction and their support for countries around the world. They plowed a bunch of money, several $billions, into the World Health Organization at a time when the United States has been withdrawing from the WHO. And we had a webinar last week, 2 weeks ago, with Dr. James Hildreth of Meharry College here in Nashville, and I asked him about the World Health Organization, and he made the point that the WHO is the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, for many countries around the world that doesn't have such an institution as we do.
That's absolutely true. And the idea that, you know, you defund the fire department when you're in the middle of fighting fires doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So,
yeah,
who knows? But
yeah.
the Chinese, I think you're absolutely right, Pat. The Chinese are using this pandemic to their political favor, in the sense that they very much want to emerge from this as being seen as a world leader, as one of the preeminent powers in the world. And if you get in trouble, you need some help, China will be there for you.
Yeah.
And so they're giving PPE, and they're sending in flights with equipment on it and that kind of stuff. None of which I think we are doing.
Yep. So a black eye on us, and you know, we'll see how that all works out. I think the last piece of this topic, Dick, is the press issue that China, early on in the pandemic, they tossed out the reporters from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and a couple of others. Basically would not renew their visas, so they couldn't get back in during the time when the pandemic was really taking off. The Trump administration has responded by tossing out some Chinese journalists. So I guess that raises the question. I know, Dick, as a distinguished diplomat, you're familiar with the concept of reciprocity in diplomacy and tit for tat, et cetera. But some wonder, for a country that champions freedom of the press, if we could have achieved some kind of advantage by not throwing out the Chinese journalist and being just as you know, going to the same level as Beijing, but use that as a point that you know, we're open and transparent, and we offer journalists the opportunity to look around America, while China does not.
I think it's a good point, Pat, but we still have journalists in China. I think, you know, it's not a 100% ban, and you'll see reporting from time to time.
Yeah, some of the broadcast operations I've seen, NBC, CNN, and some others reporting. And you know, obviously there's news coming out, but clearly China has thrown water on the...
Reciprocity is a cardinal rule of international diplomacy, but you don't have to exercise it so strictly that you're cutting your nose off to spite your face, kind of a thing. So what is in our best interest? Would it be to let some Chinese journalists stay here so they could report what's actually going on back in the United States? I think it's in the interest of the United States to be as well understood and known as possible, and not live in a, you know, hide away somewhere and let people think of, well, what are they going to do now, kind of stuff. Yep,
for sure. Okay, well, moving on, our next topic, and this is an area that doesn't get a lot of play, Dick, in the current news reporting, is what's going on in Libya. And I think not too many people are aware that there's an active civil war in Libya, and that the sides have roughly split the country in two, and it's gone back and forth a little bit. Just to give people kind of the play-by-play here, Libya, as everyone knows, is a very large landmass in North Africa, borders on the Mediterranean to the north, and it's very important to Europeans and to the international community, contributes to the global energy output. We'll talk a little bit about its energy supplies, but it has been in the past a major oil supplier, especially to Europe, and especially of a certain kind of crude oil, which is easy because of the topography in Libya to get out of the ground. So it's a low cost extraction, which um, as far as the cost of a barrel of oil, that's a major factor. That's why the Middle East exports so much oil. It's easy to extract as opposed to places like Siberia, where there's a lot of oil. It's just hard to get at. Also, the quality of Libyan oil is important. But we're going to dive down a little bit into what's going on in the battle for Libya. And people may recall that our good friend Muammar Gaddafi was in control of Libya for decades. The United States had some trouble with him in the 70s and 80s. He was responsible for bombing a discotheque and was found to have agents who were behind the Pan Am bombing over Lockerbie, Scotland. The United States responded with military force. So our relationship with Gaddafi in Libya was adversarial. And then we kind of made up a little bit in the 2000s. There were some agreements, and we actually denuclearized Libya. They had a nuclear program, and they had a lot of nuclear materials, fissile material, and production facilities. All that stuff was bagged up and carted off to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And I think Libya saw the handwriting on the wall that it would not be in their best interest to become a nuclear weapons state. But in October of 2011, Mr. Gaddafi ran afoul of an uprising. And Dick, you may recall seeing the footage of him getting dragged out of a drainage tube and out in the desert. He had fled Tripoli when his
summarily executed.
Yeah, right there in the middle of the road. So that was the end of Gaddafi, and since then it's been a battle back and forth between forces in the west, based mostly in Tripoli, and forces in the east. So the current breakdown of who's who there. In the west, there's the Government of National Accord in Tripoli, and that's the government that is recognized by the United Nations. And the head is Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj, and they are backed strongly by Turkey as well as Qatar and Italy. You would think they would also be backed by the UN, since the UN has thrown in with that government. But a number of UN nations are backing the Libyan National Army, which is the eastern section under General Khalifa Haftar. And he had made significant advances across the central part of Libya and was encircling the GNA strongholds in the west. But recently, the GNA has had some major successes in pushing back with the strong support of Turkey. Turkey is all in on the side of Sarraj in the west. So we're seeing that the forces of Haftar are being pushed back, and that's even though the Russians have thrown their support behind Haftar, building a large presence in the central part of the country. You can see this photo shows an air base, Al Jafra airfield in Libya, and what is highlighted there is a Russian Fulcrum fighter, one of their frontline warplanes that has been deployed to Libya to fight on the side of Haftar. So despite the Russian presence in Libya, Haftar is being pushed back, and now there's a lot of efforts on the part of the international community to try to negotiate some sort of resolution to the situation. You can see in the photo here, there was a international conference on Libya called the Berlin Conference, and the representatives of the major powers, the um, uh, European Union, and some others. You can see Mr. Putin there, and behind him in the next row is Secretary of State Pompeo. So all the major powers are interested in what's going on in Libya, even though it's not much in the news. You can also see the laydown of where crude oil is in Libya and how it gets out. A lot of it is in the east. So it's important to the economy of Libya that the civil war stop, the sides reconcile. I don't think there's going to be one side taking over control of the other's area. I suspect, and Dick, you can probably provide some sense of how these things work out if there's a ceasefire and negotiations, and really one side is not achieving any dominance over the other.
Well, I don't know, Pat. Do you think that the possibility of Libya ceasing to exist as Libya is going to be on the table?
Well, I think that's a definite possibility, that it be divided in two.
When you look back at the history of Libya, I mean, Libya is a huge landmass, as you said early on.
Right.
But the bulk of that landmass is desert, and it's down in the south, and there really is nothing and nobody there except maybe some interest in minerals and resources from the ground, and oil and things of that sort.
Right.
But Tripoli is in the eastern part of, the western
West.
part of.
Right. Benghazi is the major city in the east.
Yeah. So Tripoli traditionally has looked to the north, right? You have good relations with Europe. Benghazi has looked to the east, and they have not really been, this was put together back in the good old days when the European powers were dividing things up. So Libya is not an ethnically cogent kind of a country.
Sure.
So I don't know what's going to happen, but I think my sense is that they could probably get along a lot better if they were two separate entities.
Yeah, I suspect that in the long term we'll be looking at an East Libya and a West Libya, much as Sudan is now Sudan and South Sudan.
South. Yep.
A couple of interesting facts along with this story, Dick. The Russians who are fighting for the LNA, the Eastern Coalition, they've dispatched mercenaries. They are recruiting mercenaries from Syria. So the Russians go into Syria and they roll up a bunch of guys and fly them over to Libya to fight on their behalf for General Haftar. And there's a contract organization called the Wagner Group.
Sounds pretty benign, doesn't it?
It does. It probably, it's one of those places you'd walk past in an office building in Northern Virginia. It certainly doesn't sound Syrian or Russian to me, but that's the name of the contract organization that's rolling up all the Syrian fighters. So they're fighting on the side of the LNA in the east. Another interesting fact is that Haftar, the general in the east, he was a close ally of Gaddafi, and then the two of them had a falling out. But he lived in Virginia for nearly 20 years, and some say that he was under the care and maintenance of the CIA before returning to Libya to help in Gaddafi's demise. So the United States apparently has some strong connection with Haftar. But the Trump administration is trying to bring this thing to a close because, right now oil is an easy commodity to ignore this or that country, but clearly the world wants to bring all that supply back into operation.
Well, sits on the other side of the Mediterranean, so the literal states of Europe are concerned. France and Italy and Spain. I mean, they're going to have to deal with that on the other side of the water. So it's important that hopefully there's some stability and peace that will be coming to Libya sometime down the road.
Well, that brings up one last important point: the refugee flow from northern Africa. A lot of it
Yeah,
that's going into, especially Italy, is going through Libya from the sub-Saharan states and even from some of the eastern regions. But
right.
Libya is an important jumping-off point for refugee flows into Europe, and that's been a persistent problem basically since the Arab Spring in 2011. Um, that Europe has had to absorb all of those refugees fleeing from Africa. Okay, Dick, we're on a roll here. Last but not least, another global intractable um, situation, the Israel-Palestine situation. And we mentioned this a couple of weeks ago that Israel was on the verge of annexing portions of the West Bank, but it's getting closer to happen. I've heard in the past week that July 1st or thereafter might be a time where we see some forward movement on that. I think the reporting we had a couple of weeks ago was when the government, the factions in the government consolidated, and they had a solidarity government that was kind of the signal that things were going to start to move forward. And we may recall that the Trump administration, with the support of Mr. Jared Kushner, put together a peace plan that included this annexation plan. It's notable that no Palestinians participated in the conversation of what this peace plan was going to look like. So it begs the question: how do you have a peace plan when one side is occupying the territory of the other side,
Yeah.
and the other side is not participating at all?
Well, let me just jump in, because we talked about annexation, Pat, and maybe it is a word that has specific meaning, and it can be sum up kind of images of seemingly bygone colonial area when states used to fight over the spoils of war. But annexation continues into the modern era. For example, Indonesia annexed East Timor in 1975. Briefly, Iraq annexed Kuwait in 1990, and that started the first Iraq war.
Yeah,
Russia,
they considered it for a long time one
yeah,
of their provinces
that's right.
before
Then
they
Russia
invaded.
annexed Crimea, and in 2014 basically said, no, this is ours, not yours, Ukraine. So now, Israel's joined the club. In 1980. It annexed the majority Palestinian East Jerusalem, which was not part of Israel, but became when the Israelis annexed it. And a year later, it annexed the Golan Heights, which it had captured from Syria in one of the wars. So in short, annexation is when a country declares that a piece of land outside its borders is part of the state. And often this is done after military occupation, and whether people living there want it or not. And international law is fairly clear about annexation. Basically, it is illegal. So in our area, imagine, for example, that the United States decided, we need to do something about Tijuana, so let's just annex Baja California. And we go down there and we say, this is now part of the United States, it's no longer part of Mexico. That's what annexation is all about.
Yes, and we're about to see it happen, and you can see on the maps there that depict the initially from left to right, the initial partition of Palestine by the United Nations in 1947, and then what became recognized after several wars, with Israel marked out there in the West Bank, Gaza Strip. And the Golan Heights, which were captured in the '67 war from Syria. So Israel has already annexed the Golan Heights with the support
Right.
of the United States. And I think there was a sign, Trump, on the road to the Golan Heights. My memory is failing me, but there was a sign recognizing Trump as having supported the annexation. So that's already been accomplished during the Trump administration, and now it looks like Israel.
Well, and moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem
Yeah.
was an international city that was split between Palestinians and Israelis, and now Israel has annexed the entire city and basically said that is the capital of Israel, and the United States has basically recognized that by moving our embassy to Israel, to Jerusalem, which was a very controversial move at the time it was made under the Trump administration.
Yeah, and the original partition you can see on the map there, that purple area was designated by the UN in the time of the partition as not the sovereign area of either Israel or Palestine, that it was an open historic religious entity, but it was taken over completely in the '67 war and held East Jerusalem held since then by Israel. So you can see the areas on the map of the proposed annexation, Israeli settlements, and the Jordan Valley. There are some areas that are being given up by Israel down along the border south of Gaza that would be turned over to the Palestinians. But clearly, the West Bank would be carved up. It's already difficult for Palestinians to move from some areas to another due to cordon areas, highways that connect settlements, and so forth. So this is going to be seen as a significant impingement on the Palestinian position in the Middle East peace process.
So again, about down at the end of the road, what is the end of the road here? How does Israel live with Palestine? How do the Palestinians live with the Israelis? And this has been going on and on and on. And most folks say, you have to figure out a way to live together. There are many, many Palestinians that are living in Israel. And in fact, one of the little tidbits on the COVID-19 thing was the number of Palestinian medical personnel that are working in Israel fighting the pandemic.
Yeah.
So
I don't know the answer to that, Dick, and
I fear Mr. Kushner doesn't either. But basically, his plan is a non-starter with the Palestinians. So
yeah, I think they began that process believing they would have a lot of support from the Gulf Arabs to put pressure on the Palestinians.
Yeah.
And there were a couple of conferences in which they talked about billions of dollars being provided to the Palestinians to get their economy up and running and have some progress in that area. But the Palestinians weren't biting, and I think the Gulf Arabs just lost interest.
Well, it looks like we've hit all 5 topics there. Pat, what do you think?
I think it's time for the answer to our question.
Oh, yeah. So let's review the question, huh? While the job is not done, there is no denying this is a milestone. Thank you, New Zealand, said this Prime Minister in comments marking the elimination of COVID-19, one of the first nations to achieve this milestone. So who is the Prime Minister of New Zealand? Pat?
Jacinda Ardern.
That's right. Ms. Ardern.
She's been in the news a lot lately. They had an earthquake in New Zealand, and she was about to be interviewed by some foreign correspondent, and she was sitting in her office, and everything started shaking dramatically, and she maintained her cool, calm demeanor in the face of the earthquake. And the correspondent said, "Prime Minister, are you okay to continue?" And she said, "Sure, let's go. I don't have any lights over me, and everything seems to be fine." So she was cool, calm, and collected in the middle of I guess New Zealand, they get shaken up quite a bit.
Well, she's one of many of these women prime ministers that are really doing the job and making things happen in the proper way around the world. So maybe we'll see more of that kind of elected official.
For sure. Well, she got in the news initially with the response to that tragic mass shooting that they had in New Zealand, and she called upon the legislature there to enact laws, gun control laws, basically disarming, some of the weapons that just didn't belong in the hands of the public. So that was really the first glimpse internationally that we had of Prime Minister Ardern. And other than an appearance on Colbert, I don't think she's.
Well, she has a little baby too, and the baby's been involved with government. She takes the child to the office from time to time, I think, things like that.
Yeah, that's right. I remember that. Okay, well, Dick, that about does it for our 5 topics today. I think that was a good rundown of what's going on in the news. Thanks for your expertise and perspective
from your leadership, Patrick.
From Foggy Bottom. We will hang on a second. We have
got a
question in the queue. Regarding the Germany-U.S. situation, the U.S. is one of the only NATO states that pays its 2% in defense spending, if I recall from WorldQuest. Let me see, who is this from? Jillian. Thank you, Jillian. Jillian is a Hume-Fogg High School graduate, WorldQuest champion, and is now going to Wellesley. And rumor has it she's volunteered to be on the staff of the Tennessee World Affairs Council.
Hey.
So thank you for your question, Jillian. She asked, she'd be curious to know if Germany is the only NATO country that we have troops in, and what would spark specifically this pullout, and whether anyone believes it would have the desired effect. Hopefully.
The answer is no. We have troops in other NATO countries, starting, I guess, in the east with Turkey, a major NATO U.S. air base in Incirlik. In fact, and rumor has it, and the press has reported that that's one of the forward deployed nuclear weapons depots that we have around the world.
Rumor has it.
Huh?
The rumor mill.
Well, yeah, but you can dig up and sort of find out and get a fair idea of where the U.S. nuclear weapons might be. Italy is another place where there are a number of U.S. personnel in both naval bases and Air Force bases, right?
Yep. Spain
also, and Germany, and the UK. We have quite a relationship that goes back quite a ways with the UK people. So, and I think there may be a token presence. Well, now we've put troops into Poland to try to give Poland some backbone relative to its common border with Russia. And the Baltic countries, we also have troops rotating in and out. So we've forward deployed a whole lot of people.
Yeah. I'll mention that I was stationed in Naples, Italy, and that's where I met my wife, who was also in the United States Navy. And that's how I wound up in Tennessee. She won the coin flip after I retired from the Navy. So I can tip my hat to NATO.
Yeah.
But it was a U.S. element there in Naples. Okay, well, Jillian, thanks for that question. I hope that answered that. And we look forward to another edition of the News Review next week at our normal time, 2 p.m. And we hope that you all will be with us. And we invite you to our webinar tonight, Global Nashville with Carl Dean. He'll be talking with Amr El-Husseini, a Nashville-based international business person who is a consultant, entrepreneur, venture capitalist. He's got his finger on the pulse of local and international economic issues, and he's going to talk about the future of Nashville's economy. And tomorrow we have a special program at 1 p.m. We'll be talking with 2 people from the Alliance for Securing Democracy, Rachel Dean Wilson and David Salvo from the ASD will be here taking a bipartisan look at the foreign interference in the 2020 election. It's just, 150 days away or something like that, Dick?
In November.
Yep. So it's right around the corner, and we know for certain, based on the intelligence community and the U.S. Senate, that the Russians interfered in the 2016 election, and there's no sign that they've backed off. So look forward to a great conversation tomorrow. Mark Braden from our board of directors will be moderating. That's 1 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon. Don't miss that. And again, tonight, our Global Nashville with Carl Dean, talking with Amr El-Husseini. So for Ambassador Dick Bowers, this is Pat Ryan from the Tennessee World Affairs Council. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next week.
Thanks, Pat. Bye-bye.